Matt Schauf and Jared Small of DraftSharks.com here to preview week 1 of the NFL season. Jared, it is here. The time for everything that we've been working on for months to finally come to fruition. Show us what we were right about. Show us what we were wrong about. Obviously, what we're going for is being right about more things than we were wrong about. We know there's going to be plenty of both, but it's all about being more right than wrong, right?
Yeah, but I'm more curious to know what I'm wrong about.
Those
That's
always
always that's
sting
all
more.
they do. Yeah, that's always the thing about week one though. Like, what did I just not see coming? Week one is the week we'll see the biggest changes in the fantasy landscape. From week one to week two. It's gonna be fun. It's gonna be a little painful, but it's gonna be mostly fun. Hopefully.
Of course, the other side of that is we have to decipher what actually changes and what is a mirage in week 1 that we shouldn't change in week 2. But that's going to be more of a week 2 question right now. We're focused on week 1, and we're going to be pulling a lot of the stuff for this show and every week's version of this show from Jared's Matchups That Matter article that posts on DraftSharks.com every week with, some key numbers, situations, players, stats that you should know as you're setting your lineups for that coming week. The primary focus of it this week, that right up top, it says, don't lean too heavily on matchups. Why is that?
Yeah, the intro is basically saying, this is the least valuable version of the article we're going to get all year because we should be weighing matchups the least this week, right? Because, listen, we don't have 2024 defensive data. Doesn't mean we're not weighing matchups at all. If you look at our week 1 rankings, you'll see matchups influencing some guys. We have implied totals, which we're going to talk about. Those are obviously all calibrated for 2024. We can look at 2023 defensive data and sort of consider what's changed and kind of project how these defenses are going to be. But, if matchups are, 30 to 40% of our weekly rankings process most weeks, maybe it's 15 or 20% this week. It's definitely weighed less in the rankings in week 1.
Yeah, you can look at the Jets defense and say it was really good last year. A lot of the reasons it was really good last year are still there. There's no reason that they should tank. So they're probably going to be really good again. But, plenty of other defenses changed a lot of things. Some could be better or worse, even without a whole lot of player change from year to year. So we don't want to overrate anything, but we definitely are looking at what happened last year and letting it influence some. Like I said, you're going to want to check out Matchups That Matter every week for the things that probably will matter. You're also going to want to check your team intel page on DraftSharks.com before you set your lineup every week. That particular page customizes lineup recommendations to your team in your format, uses the same sync that you used for your draft war room, takes our weekly projections, including player ceilings, consensus projections. It applies your league specific scoring and lineup settings. It shows you exactly who we would start in our lineups. And what it does beyond that is it removes the bias. Like, if you come to me on Saturday and say, Matt, who should I start between these two guys at running back? There's going to be some bias built in there because, I don't like James Cook as a player. So I'm probably going to lean a bit more away from him than maybe I should based on his situation. He's actually a guy we'll talk about. What we're trying to do with that process that goes into the team intel page is really take as much bias out of it as possible, because we all have it no matter how hard we work against it. We've got all the factors going in to give you the sharpest recommendations for your lineup that we possibly can. So, Jared, let's get now to some of the factors that show up in Matchups That Matter, some of the factors that will affect who we are or are not starting this week. Let's start with some game situations, because you've got the highest Vegas game totals listed in there. And for a simple reason, we would love to have players in games where a lot of points are scored, because that's the crux of fantasy production. So run me through some of the maybe games to target this week.
No big surprises to me when I looked at the games with the highest totals this week. Rams, Lions, number 1. That's the Sunday night game. Jaguars, Dolphins, 2. Good offenses. I think I have major questions about Miami's defense. I think the defense could take a big step back this year and actually create more shootouts for Dolphins games. So Jags, Dolphins is a fun one. Packers, Eagles on Friday night. Texans, Colts, they're at 48.5. And then Cardinals, Bills is at 48.0. So again, this is, all this stuff is built into the rankings you're going to find on DraftSharks and the projections in your team intel page. But if you are, breaking ties between two closely ranked players, this is something to consider. Like you said, Matt, you want guys in games that are going to produce a lot of points.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some specific players from some of these teams. And I was going to say the same thing. You're not reaching way past somebody you drafted as your clear wide receiver 2 just because there's a wide receiver in that Jags Dolphins game. You want to use this more as like a tiebreaker. If you've got 3 guys grouped together and one is in this game that's among the highest projected for the week, it might be a reason to go ahead and lean in that direction. On the other side, we've got the teams, the individual teams with the lowest implied totals. And I put a question mark on whether we should avoid, because I think it's important to decipher by position and by situation, just because you're looking at an offense that's among the lowest projected for the week, it doesn't mean that be scared about everybody in that lineup and try to avoid them at all costs, right?
I tend to shy away from running backs on these teams with low implied totals because these teams are obviously going to be underdogs. We want our running backs to be favored. Now, again, that's less important with someone like Alvin Kamara, who's going to do most of his scoring via the passing game, and also tight ends. I like to use tight ends on teams with high implied totals because touchdowns are such a big part of tight end scoring. So yeah, it definitely varies by position. Obviously, varies by player. Again, this is all built into our rankings. But yeah, I mean, the Patriots lowest implied total of the week. I would guess you're going to find New England near the probably at the bottom of this list, like every week until Drake May takes over and maybe starts to show something. So New England way at the bottom at 16.25. We have Denver, Vegas, Carolina, Pittsburgh also near the bottom, and then the Cowboys 19.25 implied total this week. What is that? Tied for fifth lowest on the week. That's the one that sticks out to me. Every time I look at it, I kind of do a double take. This is not a case of the lines makers being low on the Cowboys. We did our season long implied total article, and the Cowboys are implied for the fifth most points over the course of the season. This is just a matchup thing against the Browns defense that was awesome last year. First in yards allowed, third in yards per play allowed. Browns were top 9 against all 4 positions in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So tough matchup across the board for all these Dallas guys. And the other thing too is that Dallas is on the road. They were much, much better at home last year. But we get into some specific numbers with Dak Prescott, but don't expect them to hit their ceiling in this matchup on the road in Cleveland week 1.
Perfect transition there because, as you mentioned, Cleveland was a good defense last year, so the matchup's not great. The Cowboys were a lot different on the road scoring wise than they were at home. So those are 2 reasons to be down on the Cowboys this week versus the rest of the season. And really, if I'm looking at the lineup, it's pretty easy to be down on a lot of the players. CeeDee Lamb's obviously starting for any team. Jake Ferguson's probably starting for any team that drafted him. I'm happy to avoid that backfield, even if I drafted any Dallas running backs, because we don't know what the touch distribution is going to be. And it's not a good game environment for running back scoring. Brandon Cooks, Jalen Tolbert, those are guys in the we'll see category, or when we get to bye weeks, maybe I need him. Certainly not somebody you're looking to start in week 1.
Yeah, Dak Prescott is someone I would be looking to bench. Like, we talked about someone like Geno Smith, if he's available on your waivers and you have someone droppable to carry a second quarterback for this week, I would start Geno Smith over Dak Prescott this weekend. We talked about the matchup, but then Dak Prescott on the road last year, just 227 yards and 1.6 touchdowns per game. Compare that to his averages at home, 309 yards and 2.8 touchdowns per game. He was just a completely different quarterback on the road versus at home. So, factor all that together. Prescott's completion rate and yards per attempt was also way down on the road. So I think Prescott is very, very benchable in week 1.
Feels icky if he was the first quarterback that you drafted for your team this year, but it's a sensible spot to sit him as long as you have, a good option. And Geno Smith, I agree, is basically the best option in that kind of streamable level of ownership category. Baker Mayfield's another guy who's close. Honestly, can't say whether I would start Baker Mayfield over Dak Prescott on my own lineup. I probably wouldn't. I'd probably play Dak, but I will not be at all surprised if Baker Mayfield outscores Dak Prescott this week.
Yeah, agreed. And then, more like, upper level quarterbacks, Jared Goff at home versus the Rams, I think is a pretty easy start for me over Dak Prescott. I would start Trevor Lawrence and Tua Tagovailoa in that game over Dak Prescott. He's 17th in our quarterback rankings this week. So there are a whole lot of guys we'd be using over Dak Prescott.
And Jaden Daniels might be a guy that you drafted onto a Dak team. I would certainly start Jaden Daniels over Dak Prescott this first week. One other quarterback who was probably drafted in or near starter territory that we're leaning towards sitting this week is Brock Purdy at home against the Jets. Could work out for him, but I think you can probably find a safer option with just as much upside this week than Brock Purdy.
For sure. Yeah. It's about as tough a spot as you can get for Brock Purdy. For my money, the Jets have the best secondary in the NFL, maybe the best defense in the NFL. I feel better about Purdy than I do Dak. I mean, for starters, the Niners have a 24.25 point implied total. That's 9th on the week. That's lower than they're going to be most weeks, but it's still 9th on the week. Purdy did get Trent Williams back as his stud tackle. Brandon Ayuk's going to play. We'll look for reports on how much Ayuk's going to play, but he's going to be out there. So I think Purdy is lower in our ranks than usual, but again, I do feel better about him than I do Dak Prescott this week.
Yeah, he's got more going on around him. I agree with that. Let's move over to running back. And we already talked about Geno Smith at QB. Let's start with the running back on that team. And most of the talk from us and from everybody else about the Seattle offense this offseason has been about the pass offense because they got a new offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, who was pass heavy in college. So it makes sense that it should be good for Geno Smith. It should be good for Jackson Smith-Njigba. But if the offense is successful, it should also be good for Kenneth Walker, who has gotten some 3-down buzz. And maybe I just missed it, but I haven't heard a whole lot about Zach Charbonnet from Seattle.
The loudest drumbeat out of Seattle this summer was that Ken Walker is kind of going to be a focal point of this offense. Multiple beat writers and NFL insiders kind of got that intel from Seattle. So, we'll see exactly what Walker's role looks like. He was not a big pass catcher in college and has not been a big pass catcher in the NFL. So, we'll see exactly how much more he does there. But again, you're playing him for the rushing for the most part. And this is an excellent week 1 spot for Kenneth Walker at home against Denver. The Seahawks are 6-point favorites. They have a 24-point implied total. Denver last year dead last in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs, and I would expect them to be, in the bottom 5 probably again this year.
He probably loses some receiving to Zach Charbonnet, but I would guess that it'll be more in the realm of Joe Mixon to Samaje Perine in Cincinnati 2 years ago than, like Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt several years ago in Cleveland. I don't think that we're going to see Kenneth Walker leave the field because 2 coaching staffs now have talked about that he can catch passes, even though he didn't do a lot of it in college. So I think for this week, Ken Walker is right on the fringe of RB1 territory, somebody that I would be happy to start, probably in plenty of cases over a running back that I might have drafted ahead of him.
Yeah, Walker's 13th in our week 1 PPR running back rankings. He climbs even higher if you're talking, half PPR or non-PPR. So pretty much a must start, and definitely someone I think you can expect to see in our DFS articles on Friday.
Ooh, a little teaser there. A couple more running backs going against each other. James Cook, James Conner, obviously not actually going against each other because that would be weird if both offenses were on the field, but Bills against Cardinals. The Bills are pretty heavy favorites. I think it's a solid situation for both running backs. We don't like that James Conner's on a team that is a heavy road underdog, but he should be the 3-down back for a team that's, going to need him to do something.
Yeah.
But to me, James Cook is a bit more interesting because I don't like him overall. I don't trust him to be a workhorse this season, but he opens the year in an excellent situation against a defense that I think is probably going to be pretty bad as a home favorite. And clearly the OC late last season favored using James Cook a lot. So I think he's in a very good situation for week 1, and we'll see beyond that.
Yeah, Arizona was 31st in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs last year. So this is another defense we're likely going to be attacking all season. Cook and Conner both have, these rookies that, maybe later this season are threats to take work. But I think in week 1, they're, about as least threatening as they're going to be. So really, Cook and Conner should both have really strong roles on Sunday.
So I wouldn't reach for a starter over Conner, but he's, a bit less exciting because of his team's situation here. The Broncos backfield, if you were around Jared at all this offseason, you heard him talking about Javonte Williams, I'd be like, hey, how are your girls doing? He's like, actually, Javonte Williams looks amazing. And I said, that's not who I'm asking about. But here we are at the season, Jared. They are underdogs. They have a low implied total for week 1. What are you doing with Javonte Williams in your week 1 lineups?
Yeah, listen, Denver's going to be underdogs with a low implied total a lot of weeks this week. But, the point is that this is going to be a running back centric offense. That's how Sean Payton operates. That's how this team is set up. The wide receiver core very unproven behind Cortland Sutton. The tight end core unproven still, especially for week 1. I think this is going to be, Audric Estime will be active. I don't think he's going to play a whole lot. I think it's going to be Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin handling, 90-95% of the backfield work. So I think they're both in play. The fact that Denver's 6-point road underdogs, you might think, more of a McLaughlin game as a pass catcher. But Javonte Williams saw 58 targets last year. He's going to be involved in the passing game too. So I think, Javonte is in low-end RB2 territory in our rankings. And I think McLaughlin is someone you can consider as a flex play in deeper PPR leagues.
Yeah, the Broncos weren't very good last year, and their running back still scored the 6th most PPR points. Most of that was receiving. They caught a bunch more passes, 15 more than any other team. So we know they want to throw the ball to running backs, and they did so last year despite Javonte Williams being a bit limited coming off that knee injury. We're supposed to get a better version of Javonte Williams this year. We've got year 2 Jaleel McLaughlin, so he's probably going to be better than he was last year. So yeah, no reason for us to expect less work for this backfield. I feel solid about playing Javonte Williams this week, especially in PPR. McLaughlin, I'd like to see his role before using him, but if you're in a deep enough league that he's in consideration, you can certainly think about putting him in this week. One more guy that might not seem like a week 1 starter, Jared, especially by his ADP, is Jerome Ford, but he's looking like somebody that you could put in your lineup, right?
Yeah, another guy who should be a good touch bet this week. We obviously know Nick Chubb is out for at least the first 4 games. The Browns brought back Donta Foreman after releasing him, doing some of the roster gymnastics. But the fact that they exposed him to the rest of the league tells me they're not like super high on Foreman. He's probably not going to have a massive week 1 role. Pierre Strong is back. I don't expect him to have a big week 1 role either. So I mean, Ford averaged 12 carries and 4 targets per game without Nick Chubb last year. I think that's closer to his floor this week. I think you could see him get to 15 carries and 4 or 5 targets here. Tough matchup against Dallas. They were 4th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs last year. But again, I think Ford should get nice volume here. The Browns are a slight home favorite, so you're not going to have game flow working against Ford. If you drafted him, to be a factor early in the season before Chubb gets back. So I think Ford is definitely someone you can throw in your lineup as an RB2 or even a really strong RB3 or flex play.
And even if rushing is difficult against Dallas, it should be involved in the passing game as well. So Jerome Ford, pretty solid RB2 this week. If you are still watching or listening to the show at this point, then you're probably enjoying it to at least some degree, or at least you don't find us annoying enough that you had to rush back to Joe Rogan. So either way, please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel, or if you are a listener instead of a watcher, go ahead and subscribe, follow, favorite us on your chosen pod service. It'll let you know when we publish new stuff. It'll also let us know that you like what we're doing. So we greatly appreciate that support. We'll move on now to wide receivers. One of the more interesting things to consider now and to see play out is how to treat this Packers wide receiver core that was plenty, I guess, controversial ADP wise throughout the offseason. There are plenty of people saying Jaden Reed's going too early for his role. There are plenty of us wondering exactly what playing time is going to look like, especially if Christian Watson stays healthy. Now that it's week 1, what are you doing with these Packers receivers?
Yeah, like this is the Friday night game too, so we can all just sort of, sit back, watch it, see how they're using these receivers. I mean, I would start Jaden Reed and Christian Watson like as you drafted them. If you drafted Reed as your wide receiver 3, you're probably playing him. You took Watson as your wide receiver 3 or a 4, flex option, you play him. This is a good spot for the Packers passing game. A likely shootout against the Eagles. The Eagles were 31st in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers last year. Then we'll just see, how the playing time works out with Reed, Watson, and Romeo Doubs and Dontavian Wicks. I expect, as we saw last year when these guys were healthy, the Packers rotated all of them through. I expect all 4 of these guys to be somewhere between 50% of their routes to 80% of their routes, which is going to make them a bit tough to rely on a weekly basis. But to me, Reed, Watson, you can use. Doubs, Wicks, I would try not to use. If you are, picking between those 2, I would go Doubs. I do expect him to play more than Dontavian Wicks. Again, ideally, you're just kind of, sitting back and assessing the situation, seeing what we see this week.
Fantasy analysts might hate Romeo Doubs, but Matt LaFleur sounds like he loves him. So I agree. Go ahead and play Romeo Doubs. And the other change that I would personally make is now that we're here at the season and Christian Watson's healthy, I would play him ahead of Jaden Reed. I mean, I was drafting Jaden Reed before Christian Watson, in part because you have to if you want to get him because he was going first, but also because for the season, we still wanted to bake in some risk that Christian Watson's hamstrings are a problem at some point. When they are healthy, he has been used as the top receiver there. Not like a true lead number 1, but Green Bay is playing him like they want to get him the ball primarily among their receiving options. So I would go ahead and play Watson first among these Packers wideouts. I think he's the best bet for the highest level playing time. And we've seen the big playability, but certainly Jaden Reed's not far behind that. We saw him produce immediately as a rookie, and maybe he's in for even a slight role bump.
Yeah, I mean, we currently have Reed 35th in our wide receiver rankings, Christian Watson 38th, separated by 0.1 3D value point. Reed with a higher floor, Christian Watson with the higher ceiling, which I think is fair. So, yeah, I mean, these guys are right in the same mix. Again, if you took him as your wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 4, I think you just use him this week again. It should be a fun game against the Eagles.
What about Jaguars wideouts? We've got Christian Kirk higher than either of the Packers we just talked about in the PPR ranks. Wide receiver 26 there. We've also got Brian Thomas Jr. and Gabe Davis to consider.
The concern with Kirk is going to be playing time because it looks like he's only going to play, or not only, but primarily play in 3 wide receiver sets, right? It's going to be Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas when they go 2 wide receiver. But I think this is a good spot for Christian Kirk. You do have the Jags underdogs in a potential high scoring game that should lead to more 3 wide receiver usage for Jacksonville. And Christian Kirk has the slot matchup against the Dolphins, which we always like to attack. It's Cater Kohu in the slot for Miami, and I think that the weak point of that secondary. So, with Kirk in the slot should be an advantageous matchup for him this week. Plus, he's the guy with chemistry with Trevor Lawrence, right? Which should mean more early in the season. I think as we get into the season, Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas probably will become bigger factors.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about Christian Kirk being the third guy, but they have 3 wide receivers on the field most of the time. He still led all their wideouts in receptions per game last year. He led the team in receptions the year before. So it's a concern and it's an overall limitation on Christian Kirk's numbers, but you can see it. He's inside our top 30. So we're going to go ahead and start him and we'll see what happens there. Brian Thomas Jr., Gabe Davis are interesting. It would be nice to not have to play either one, to have a deep enough roster with wide receivers that you like enough that you don't need to start one of them right away. And then you can just see what happens, see the playing time, see the target share, see how good the offense is, because that's been up and down. I'd probably start with Gabe Davis over Brian Thomas Jr. just because veteran versus rookie. But I mean, it's a coin flip. They're both new to this situation. We haven't seen any actual Jaguars games with either player, so it's a guess.
Davis and Thomas would be like desperation plays. Hopefully you don't have to go there week 1. The nice thing about Davis especially is I think he's going to be on the field like almost every snap for this team. That's what we saw in the preseason. I think, they like his, blocking ability on run plays. He's a bigger body receiver. So he's just going to be on the field a lot in a likely high scoring game. And that alone gives him some fantasy upside.
And you probably think, I know Gabe Davis, we've seen him, we know what he is. Maybe that's the case, but maybe we don't. He's in a new situation now. He doesn't have a dominant number 1 wide receiver across the field from him. So there are changes. It might be different. How do we treat these Texans wideouts, Jared? I think it's the big difference from the other 2 situations is that regardless of how you felt about their draft price, now you've either got them or you don't. And if you did pay what it took to get any of these 3 Texans wideouts, I think you probably go ahead and start them this week.
Yeah, all 3 are in the top 28 of our wide receiver rankings this week. I think you're going to see that most weeks, honestly. Now, more often than not, at least one of the guys is going to disappoint, right? It's going to be tough for all 3 to hit, but like the upside on all 3 to get these guys is too big to consider sitting under them. And especially this week, I love the Texans passing game this week. CJ Stroud last year against the Colts, 384 yards and 2 touchdowns, 264 yards and 2 touchdowns, averaged 8.9 yards per attempt in their 2 meetings. To me, I think the Colts have one of the worst secondaries in the NFL. So this really should be a big game for Stroud, and I think he's going to bring at least 2 of those wide receivers with him. So if you have any of the 3, you just got to start them.
Well, now Mr. Smola gave the Colts bulletin board material, so it could be a whole different matchup this time around. Like I said, you drafted any of them, you go ahead and start them. If you drafted 2 of them, I think that you probably handled it wrong, but you might even consider starting both of them because you drafted them at that level. That's what to do this week. The only reason to sit somebody that you drafted in starter territory is if there's a real reason to not believe they're a starter this week, like we talked about with Dak Prescott in Cleveland. That's not the case with the Houston wideouts. We'll see if it works out what you had to pay for him, but you paid it, so you might as well see if your investment's going to pay off.
Well, that's a good seg to Brandon Ayuk, who we can talk about now, who is like another big name who is definitely not a must sit this week. I think he's sittable. Ayuk's 27th in our wide receiver rankings right now, 10 spots lower than he was in our preseason rankings, probably the lowest you're going to see him all season. 2 reasons for, to be wary of Ayuk this week. Obviously, the first one is that he's only going to have about 1 week of practice under his belt after signing his new deal. So I think there's a chance his snaps are limited. I think he'll play most of the game, but maybe instead of running a route on 85% of the dropbacks, he's at 75 or 70%. But and then the other thing too is this matchup against the Jets. To me, the best secondary in the league. We know about Sauce Gardner, who might shadow Ayuk. Even if he doesn't, I mean, DJ Reed on the other side is a good corner. Michael Carter is one of the top slot corners in the NFL. Last year the Jets were first in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. They reduced wide receiver scoring by 39%. The next best team was 22%. Again, you're going to have to weigh where he is against other guys in your lineup, but I do think there are some teams that are going to want to bench Ayuk this week.
And you could say the Niners just paid this guy $30 million a year. They're going to throw him the ball. That's a valid point, but it's different than CeeDee Lamb getting his contract and other guys in that category because the 49ers also have Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, and Christian McCaffrey. So they don't have to force the ball to Brandon Ayuk. They can go to other guys and still have a very good offensive night. And, throw Brandon Ayuk 5 targets, see how he is, and get him ready for the rest of the season. So I agree. I wasn't drafting Brandon Ayuk at really any point this offseason, so it's not a decision I'm making personally, but I would probably try to lean toward playing somebody over him, somebody good, not just reaching for
Yeah.
the best other option available. But if I have other good players, Christian Kirk is the one that's right next to him that we talked about. You could go either way on that one. I'm not going to tell you you're making the wrong choice, even though we have Ayuk a spot behind Christian Kirk if you go with Ayuk. But I think that's the level where, yeah, if I got Christian Kirk, I'm going to go ahead and chase the guy in the familiar situation without the question of how ready he is for this week.
I mean, even right behind Ayuk for me, Tank Dell, Terry McLaurin, those guys I just feel better about, right? Like, so I might even start a few guys below Ayuk in the rankings over him this week.
Just make sure that you factor in some personal choice. Just because we have those recommendations doesn't mean that you have to follow exactly what it says and go against something, especially if we're talking about guys that are, 1 to 2 spots apart. That's basically tied. The Bills situation, Jared, I think the interesting thing about this one is that this team is projected for the second most points in the league this week, and yet we don't have any of their wide receivers higher than 50th in our PPR rankings. What do we make of this situation?
Yeah, this is a wait and see one, kind of like Green Bay. And I think like Green Bay, this is going to be a rotation. And I hate to say it, I think Mac Hollins is going to play more than we want, and probably at the expense of Keon Coleman. Khalil Shakir is our top ranked Bills wide receiver this week. He's the one with experience in this offense, did come on a bit down the stretch last year. Curtis Samuel coming off the turf toe. He was a full go in practice on Wednesday. So I mean that's encouraging, like maybe week 2 and beyond. I would still not want to use Curtis Samuel this week. I would not want to use Keon Coleman in his NFL debut. So like for me, it's Shakir as a borderline starter, but then beyond that, Josh Allen, it's James Cook, and it's Dalton Kincaid. I think Kincaid is probably the favorite to lead the Bills in targets this weekend.
And even though you want to chase the Bills' points, this is a group that you didn't pay for like you did the Houston wideouts. So you can just wait and see. And if one of these guys catches 6 balls and scores a touchdown, it's going to be frustrating, but that's going to happen at various points throughout the year. So know that if that happens in week 1, it's fine, because there is no indication that any of these 3 wideouts we talked about or Mac Hollins is in position for a big day in week 1. It's just a situation we have to see sort out. And maybe if you want to get some of it without risking a week of your season long team, maybe it's a week to go ahead and play some Bills wideouts in DFS lineups. See what you can capture.
Exactly.
One more wideout before we finish the position, Jordan Addison. And I think we're going to have to keep watching injury reports on him. He recently returned from an ankle sprain, was out for a few weeks. Kevin O'Connell saying positive stuff, but hasn't exactly said that he's all the way back or gonna, play his normal snap allotment. So I think we're going to still have to watch how things go for Jordan Addison over these next couple of days of practices. He's outside our top 40 though, so probably not somebody that most are looking to start, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, we'll see how this progresses over the rest of the week here. Addison was limited in Wednesday's practice, which probably puts him on track to play. He'd be obviously a much comfier fantasy start if he puts in a full practice on Thursday and or Friday. It's a good spot for Addison. No TJ Hawkinson. So really, it's Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and a bunch of unproven guys behind them. And he gets a pretty beatable Giant secondary. So like a fully healthy Addison would, probably be inside the top 35 in our wide receiver rankings this week. We are docking him a bit off the ankle injury, but again, we'll see what he does in practice Thursday and Friday.
Yeah, if we get O'Connell saying by the weekend he looks great and we're going to play him his usual amount and we're happy to have him back, then he's probably rising up the rankings. If you have to decide between Addison and either of the Packers we were talking about, Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, I'd go ahead and play those guys in the Friday night game, most likely while we wait to get final word on Addison. But, it seems to be trending in the right direction. And like you said, he's in a good spot for early production this season, as long as Sam Darnold can be a little bit less Sam Darnold-y.
Yeah, I played the 2 Packers over Addison. I'd also play Xavier Worthy on Thursday night if you have that choice over Addison. Addison, if he's full go one of these next 2 days, he'd kind of climb into the same tier as those guys. So you might as well just play the guys that we know are healthy for now.
Makes sense. Tight end, and this is going to be a quick one because you should probably just start the tight end that you drafted first. Even if the matchup doesn't look great, even if you're not sure what his role exactly looks like, there's a reason that you took him where you took him. So go ahead and use that guy. One sneaky level tight end starter that we talked about on the waiver show and, in previous shows, Tyler Conklin for the Jets. Even though they're facing a tough Niners defense, he's a kind of short range guy that could be like a binky for Aaron Rodgers in his first full game with the Jets.
Yeah, for sure. Could definitely see a 5-catch, 50-yard game for Conklin on Monday night, which would be fine in PPR. The other guy I want to throw out real quick, I know he's probably not available on waivers, but he might be someone you drafted as part of a tight end platoon. But I do like Dalton Schultz this week again, just because it's a great spot for the Texans passing game. I think, you could get 300 yards and multiple touchdowns from CJ Stroud. And last year, Colts were bad against wide receivers. They were also 29th in adjusted points allowed to tight ends.
Pat Fryermuth, another guy that wasn't
Yep.
inside the top 12 in ADP, but might be paired in tight end duos. A good spot to go ahead and take a shot on his upside because there are not a whole lot of attractive receiving options in Pittsburgh. He should get a decent number of targets, assuming that Arthur Smith does not have them run the ball 58 times. Defense. Jared, we talked about the Seahawks and Chargers already, so I don't think there's a whole lot more to say. It's pretty easy to see why they're in good spots. The Seahawks are home against the Broncos, second lowest implied total of the week, just 18 points. The Chargers are home against the Raiders, who have the third lowest implied total. So we've got favored home defenses against teams that are expected to not score many points. Both of those are streaming level defenses. If you drafted them, they're defenses that you're going to want to start this week and probably next week. One that you and I disagreed on a bit this week, though, is the Vikings D. So why don't you tell me what you like about Minnesota?
Yeah, I like the Vikings D as an upside play this week. I think Seattle and the Chargers are safer, and I would probably lean towards them. I definitely lean towards Seattle in a season-long lineup. Minnesota is someone I'm going to play a lot in DFS tournaments this week, even if you do need a lower level streamer in season-long. I just like the upside. Minnesota very easily was the blitz heaviest defense in the NFL last year. We like that. We want sack and takeaway opportunities, and of course they're playing Daniel Jones, who has been known to take sacks and throw interceptions in his first game off of last November's ACL tear. So I do think there's upside to Minnesota's defense, even if it's not, a top 15 real life unit.
Yeah, I would certainly agree that there's upside. I agree with it as a DFS play. I would not use the Minnesota defense this week unless I absolutely needed to in like a 14 team league because it was a bad defense last year. They renovated their pass rush. So I don't know how good it's going to be. Jonathan Grenard, they signed another edge from Miami. They drafted Dallas Turner. So they might come out in this game and get 5 sacks, or they might get 1. Daniel Jones got a lot better with taking care of the ball. His last 2 non-injured seasons, he got much better in the INT category. Last year, we saw him go out and have an awful week 1 against Dallas. And then the next week he went to Arizona and was fantasy QB1 overall. So that's the range of outcomes. We could get week 1 Daniel Jones, or we could get week 2 Daniel Jones from last year. And that's what I'd like to try to avoid if I have a better defense option, because, like we said at the top of the show, we're really going on last year's results and other past things. We don't have any data from this year. So we just don't know about Daniel Jones or the Vikings D yet.
Yeah, sure. Again, low floor for Minnesota, but I do like the upside. Really, when I'm picking a fantasy defense, if I don't have one of the top ones, give me one that I think has some upside.
Should I sit the Jets, though? They were a top defense last year. They're a top fantasy defense overall, but this is obviously a risky spot against San Francisco. So I think anybody who drafted the Jets might be like, wait a second, should I play them right away? So what do I do if I'm in that situation?
Yeah, I would sit the Jets for the Seahawks. I'd sit the Jets for the Chargers. Minnesota, I don't know. Maybe I would just stick with the Jets just to have them for going forward. I'm not even sure who they play week 2. It's definitely a better matchup, though, because San Francisco was the worst matchup for opposing defenses last year. They reduced defense scoring by 50%. So I definitely think the Jets, in most cases, are benchable this week.
Yeah, you certainly don't want to drop the Jets, even if you decide not to play them for any reason, because after the Niners, they've got the Titans, the Patriots, the Broncos, and the Vikings all in a row. So that defense you will leave locked in. I'm glad to hear you say that you wouldn't play the Vikings over them, because I wouldn't either. Obviously a risky spot, like I said, but even these 49ers, if we look back at last year, 2 of their worst offensive performances came at home. They had 17 points and 3 turnovers in a week 8 loss to the Bengals. They had a season high 5 turnovers and a lopsided loss at the end of the year to the Ravens. So the Niners are very good. It's not a matchup that you want to target with defenses. But for this week, if the Jets are the ones that I drafted, I would probably just roll with them in this spot. Like you said, with the Seahawks and Chargers, I could see starting either one of those, but I also wouldn't go out of my way to fit in a second defense and just roll with the Jets. If I have a bad outing this week and I get, 1 or even -1 points, I'll take that. And then we'll see about those next 4 to 5 matchups that I mentioned.
Yeah, I'm with you there. If the options are, start the Jets or you have to dump them, I would just keep them.
The free agent finder obviously helps you with your waiver runs every week, but it can also specifically tell you if there's a defense available that we like better than the one that's currently in your lineup. It can do that at other positions as well, including IDPs. So you're going to want to have the free agent finder fired up. Combine that with the team intel page that I mentioned earlier that tailors the weekly projections to fit your scoring system and show you recommended lineups for your specific situation. Those are just 2 of the tools that you get access to as a DS Insider. If you're watching or listening to this and have not signed up yet, it's not too late. You can find a discounted rate for regular season access in the show notes for this podcast. No matter how well you drafted, it's going to take in-season management to win your championship. So come join us because we want to be your unfair advantage. Good.